Within the theme of natural resource management, I'll be covering a few themes on a few topics such as indigenous knowledge or traditional ecological knowledge, and also how the different worldview, or so to say, how is indigenous people's notion of life project different from the dominant development discourse. And also we would be looking at a case studies which is primarily conducted by me among the Kuki tribes in Northeast India. So in that we'll be trying to look at how the ecological knowledge are being formed and how it is being related with the cultural landscape. Now, before going into all those, it will be vital for us to look at the notion of this indigenous knowledge, how it is being understood, and what are the concepts and meanings of how indigenous knowledge comes into being. Now, indigenous knowledge, which is also popularly known as IK, means the knowledge or wisdom of the people, those who must be regarded as indigenous. Now, a question which normally arises is, can this indigenous knowledge be possessed by people who are non-indigenous, or people who belong to a different category? Now, what is this notion of indigenous, and who are indigenous people? According to the ILO convention, it regarded the indigenous people as those communities who has been residing in a particular geographical location or territory much before the intervention of the colonists, or how before the coming of this colonialism. Now, if such is the case, there are also people, communities who have been residing in a particular geographical landscape, say for the past maybe 50 years, 100 years, so and so forth. So in that context, can we say that this idea of knowledge or traditional ecological knowledge can be much more suited or relevant rather than using the term indigenous knowledge? Now, without delving much into the issue of what could perhaps be a suitable term, and about the reason why I'm trying to make a clarification is here, because I'll be trying to use the IK and TEK more or less as the same thing, and then which will be used interchangeably all throughout the lecture. Now, knowledge in a way is regarded as something which is inseparable and also pretty much embodied in their affinities with land. So this is some kind of attributes which, when we try to look at knowledge in the context of the indigenous people. Now, we all know, like, knowledge can be different type. It can be formal, the written one, which is documented, and it can be sort of knowledge which is normally orally handed down from for generations, which is pretty much the case generally among the native or the indigenous peoples. Now, their knowledge in a way is pretty much confined or embedded in the geographical landscapes which they belong to. So, in the process, they are pretty much familiar with the biodiversity, flora, fauna, and so on and so forth. Now, IK, the indigenous knowledge, is also pretty much oriented in a particular socio-cultural setting in a given time by a community or a society. Now, by saying so, that is in a particular context in a given time. Now, what if a particular socio-cultural community is being displaced from their original habitat? What could be the likely and possible repercussions? Will it affect the knowledge which they have in this particular geographical setting? So these are some of the questions which normally we can pose when we discuss this idea of indigenous knowledge. Now, mostly so far, if you look globally, the indigenous people are spread across the entire world, and many studies have been taken into account by the anthropologists, the ecologists, and so on and so forth, in trying to locate make sense of not just their socio-cultural practices, but also the idea of knowledge in terms of how they manage their natural resources. And the reason why this management of these natural resources of the indigenous people is given of late an important theme or topic of research is mainly because they are seen to be more close to nature, and then they have sustainably managed the resources. So these are some of the ideas or development which is witnessed in the past few decades. Now, according to Latour and Agrawal, what they have says is the indigenous knowledge conceals the fact that all people, irrespective of whether they are indigenous to a given area, have developed a complicated understanding of the world. So, which means with the kind of interactions or an experience, different societies develop certain kind of understanding or make sense of their natural surroundings. So, which means as I have pointed out earlier, like thus indigenous knowledge means only to those people who are termed as indigenous. So, Latour and Agrawal in a way have tries to make our doubts clear by saying that it is not necessarily the indigenous to a given area, but in the general discourse, human tends to have developed some kind of various strands of understanding of how they manage their natural resources. Now, the second thing which Ness also pointed out is, again, indigenous knowledge cannot be displaced out of its local context into another one and used for a national or international networks, or because it is autochthonous, that is empirical experience only valid as a world in its place of origin. By being terming it as autochthonous, it means that since it is being originated from that particular place, it will be only suitable and then relevant in that area. So, which means this whole idea of transferring or maybe displacing this particular knowledge for various other purpose will be not suitable and irrelevant. Now, what does Ness tries to make a point here by saying that this empirical experience and only valid as a world in its place of origin. In some sense, it makes a lot of a valid point here, because most of the time I mean what's happening globally is the trend of how this knowledge of many indigenous people or aborigines are being in a way hijacked or being transferred by many scientists, and then this knowledge are not given the rightful recognitions, or what we known as this so-called patent rights. So, this idea of transferring this idea, knowledge is something which Nash in a way is not really accepting it. Now, by saying that autochthon is something which is necessary, or the origin of its place, in a way it talks about the authenticity, which means to know things from the personal experience in places where they originate, and then thus experiencing them in their proper context. So, which means the knowledge in a way has to be understood in its context rather than out of its context. So, it is important for ones to have a first-hand experience of encountering those objects, facts and figures in its original geographical setting. So, that enables them to have that sort of personal experience in places where they originate. So, therefore, this authenticity is something which is also highly talked about when we discusses the indigenous knowledge vis-a-vis their original place. Now, Seelan and Smithson also have a different take here when they say indigenous means something is originating locally and performed by a community or society in this specified place. So, even the Seelan and Smithson were like very vocal and then talking about the idea of these autochthons, or maybe linking with its origin. Therefore, in this knowledge in a way emerges as people's perspective and experience in the environment. It is not simply based on a mere speculation or perception, but it is also based on experience in an environment at a given time and in a continuous process that is based on observation and interpretation in relation to the locally acknowledged everyday rationalities and transcendental powers. Now, over here, this observation and interpretation is something which is given an importance here. Now, why is it important to employ this idea of observation here? Because normally, if you take the examples of the indigenous people, they don't really engage into the formal classroom kind of teaching which normally we does in academics. For instance, the farming communities, let's say. So, the child or the children in the family usually observe and tries to learn from the kind of practices the parents and the elders does, maybe dibbling or trying to engage in certain kinds of activities in the farm. So, this sort of agriculture practices are not something which is being taught formally to the children, but by way of this observation, they tend to make sense of it, and they apply that when they becomes adult, or maybe when they becomes the rightful age to engage in that kind of agricultural activities. So, therefore, it is something which is pretty much an experiential kind of base in a particular environment, in a given context, and usually in a continuous process. So, it is not something that you set a particular date and then so how things are being taught. So, it's not like the kind of farmer trainings which we normally witness in the present day times, because those are based on more or less confined to the formal way of teaching based in the classroom kind of environment. So, these are rather something which is learned in that particular authentic environment. It's being experienced and it is a continuous process. So, these are some of the ideas which emerges when we talk about the indigenous knowledge of how they make sense of their environment. Now, the context of this local social performance in a way makes sense between people who normally share a common rural habitat language and knowledge, be it esoteric, open for all, or esoteric, that is a sacred knowledge. Now, why is it that the language also becomes important here in terms of imparting this knowledge, or if one tries to make sense of the knowledge? Because language that way, as we had also discussed in the previous lectures, how language in a way tends to indicate certain kinds of embedded meanings, because a language normally which is being understood by an outsiders, or maybe from an esoteric viewpoint, will be different from how the communities or those who inhabit that particular environment of their, for example, the names they give, and the names they give to animals and plants will also be sometime used in the daily discourse of trying to which will be in a way more jargonized in a way. So, this idea of language, and at the same time the kind of socio-cultural practices which is being shared between people, maybe the kind of rhythms and the agriculture ritual cycles, so on and so forth, is something which also needs to be understood. I will come to the agriculture rituals and ceremonies when we talk about the case study among the Kuki tribes. So, for the time being, we will try to sort of to have a much more fuller understanding of what indigenous knowledge is. It will be important to situate and locate by differentiating it from what are the sort of nuances between an indigenous knowledge and the knowledge which is in science or the scientific knowledge. Now, Levi-Strauss, in his Savage Mind, he tries to look at the knowledge which is being possessed by the native people. So, Levi-Strauss coined a term called bricolage. So, it is a French word which also means do it yourself. That is because Levi-Strauss was pretty much interested in knowing how societies create this novel solution by using resources that already exist in the collective social consciousness. Now, how does one make sense of, or maybe let us say the development of this ethnoecology, ethnomedicine, so on and so forth. Now, we have also discussed in the previous lectures that by using the prefix ethno, the scientific community are in a way trying to like bridge the gap, or maybe trying to accommodate the idea of these native peoples in the domain of the scientific discourse, like the ethnoecology, ethnomedicine, so on and so forth. Now, what Levi-Strauss in a way is pretty much enthusiastic in trying to look at how these societies in a way are able to, or attempts to create these novel solutions by using resources, which in a way have been already in existence or pretty much predominant in the collective consciousness, which have been witnessed every day. So, what could perhaps be the steps involved in that? Maybe for instance, will it be based on the trial and error kind of experience? So, like the native societies might not have or does not have the kind of modern laboratory systems. Now, how do they try to experience and test the sort of potentials of maybe a particular plants or herbs, shrubs, so on and so forth? So, these are something which in a way interested Levi-Strauss in trying to look at the kind of practical knowledge or solutions which these native societies have. So, the kind of activities that are performed by a handyman, that is the bricolier performs his task with materials and tools are at hand, from odds and ends, draws from the already existent consciousness and resources. Now, bricolage again is can be compared to the performance by a handyman, that is trying to use the already available resources, right? And these tasks with materials and tools that are at hand, that is in order to bring a solution, that is the odds and ends. Now, therefore, this scientific and this mythical thought should be in a way understood as valid, and that one does not supersede the other, which means they are two autonomous ways of thinking rather than two stages in an evolution of thought. So, in a way, by saying so, Levi-Strauss tries to reject the idea that that notion of this evolution or evolutionary ideas of how the mythical thought are generally termed to be uncivilized. But what Strauss tries to point out here is the scientific and mythical thought has to be in a way understood as valid, and they have their own autonomous ways of thinking rather than two stages and an evolution of thought. Now, normally if you look at these ideas of how the science or scientific community tries to do in a laboratory settings, they normally don't use tools which are irrelevant. Now, for example, let's say magic is not a primitive science. Why? Because normally magic is something which also have their own autonomous ways of how it operates. and it is effective as long as the people subscribes or are being guided by this mythical belief or the prevalence of the extraordinary kind of power which exists alongside. Now, usually in these cultural studies, that is, bricolage is used to mean the process by which people in a way acquire objects from across social divisions to create new cultural identities. Now, in the description of Levi-Strauss, he tries to talks about how it is opposed to the engineer's creative thinking, that is the science of the concrete, which proceeds from the goals to means. That is, usually a scientist or science of the concrete focuses more on setting a goals and then thereby try different means to achieve or to reach that particular goals. And on the other hand, this mythical thought, according to Strauss, rather attempts to reuse the available materials in order to solve new problems. So, which means the kind of attributes one has, that is, mythical thoughts normally tends to engage in. For example, if we give the examples of, let's say, the canoe building community. The canoe in a way is usually used for transportation, but if a particular symbol is being carved at the end of the canoe, let's say maybe a skull or any kind of images. So, as those canoe building communities, maybe for example among the Trobriand Islander, which is studied by Malinowski, talks about how this the canoe is being built. So, in order to get defend from the attack of sharks, normally these communities used to make certain kind of images and symbols at the end of the canoe. So, which in a way is pretty much instrumental and in serving their purposes. So, therefore, this idea of the reuse of these available materials to solve their new problems is something which is pretty much different from this idea of science of the concrete, which in a way proceeds from the goals to means. Now, therefore, this idea of the social cultural beliefs and practices has to be understood of how a particular community makes sense or use their resources in terms of what significant purpose that does it serve to them. Now, the bricolier again deals in the use of science, whereas the engineer deals in concepts, that is terminologies, ideas, so on and so forth. Now, as I was talking about, the carving of the images or symbols at the end of the canoe in a way is a part of science. So, concepts in a way opened possibilities of possibilities can be more of inviting critics, and then there is also a scope for improvement, and people can reject the ideas and then come up with newer ideas. So, that sort of possibilities is there, while science in a way recycles previously available meanings. So in a way it to encounter or to solve the new problems, it tries to recycle itself. Now, this particular mythical thought, that is the bricolier, builds up structures by fitting together events. So it tries to negotiate and understand different sets of events by putting them together, that is structuring them, or rather the remains of events. Maybe for instance, let us say an example of a hunting society. So, maybe before going for a hunt, they perform a particular kind of ritual, that is in terms of praying to the spirit of the animals, so that they get they are fortunate enough in the game. So, at the end, like when they go for hunting, so as a result of that, they might be getting sort of a handsome kind of return. So, normally those events which happen separately can be in a way put together and structure. So, science in a way is operated differently, because simply by virtue of coming into being or creates its means and results, as I was talking about how the goals are set to means and the form of events. So, this structure in a way is something which constantly elaborate and which are its hypotheses and theories. Now, usually in science what we do is form a hypothesis, theorize, and then tends to looked at the validity and the application of it. But rather in the context of this mythical thought, that is the bricolage, they simply tries to structure the by fitting in those events together. So, therefore, there is this continuous process of reuse and recycled of the available resources in terms of solving their problems. The scientist in a way also creates events, that is changing the world by means of structure, while the bricolage on the other hand creates structure by means of events. Now, the sort of the binaries between the science of concrete and the bricolage. So, the bricolage in a way makes creative use of the resources available at hand. It is more of a design approach, while the scientist is in a way guided by a theoretical construction. So, in a way one is pretty much theoretical and the other is practical, and it tries to make sense of the resources which is available in that particular natural surroundings. Now, as we have discussed, what then is indigenous knowledge? Indigenous knowledge is embedded in culture and more than a science to those who practice it. So, it is not simply a practice, but it is pretty much embedded in culture. And for those, if science is a small part of knowledge, treating indigenous knowledge as science in a way diminishes its breadth and value. So, to equate this indigenous knowledge as the science in a way would compromises or diminishes the real meanings embedded to an indigenous knowledge. Science and indigenous knowledge also intersect in certain subject areas such as technology, resource management, ecology, and the classification of these living organisms. Now, therefore, one can try to look at the kind of boundaries, if not the discourse where science and indigenous knowledge in a way overlap, and the subject areas in which they can be in a way contextualized. For example, in technology, on the other hand we have the science and technology, and on the we also have the indigenous knowledge technology. Then what then is indigenous technology? So one needs to make sense of how those communities are in a way practically using maybe the farming activities and so on and so forth, and in terms of resource management, how the idea of this biodiversity conservation, so on and so forth, is also strongly projected by the modern science. And alongside we also have the indigenous knowledge, how they have in a way sustainably managed the resources, and what are the ideas behind all this, right? And how ecology is being perceived differently, and also the classification of the living organisms. So both science and indigenous knowledge that way intersects in different kinds of these themes. And this IK or indigenous knowledge is usually passed on by informed experience and practical demonstration, more often shown than articulated. It is as much skill as a concept. So as I was talking about how it is being learned, that is through observation and interpretations. Therefore, this knowledge is not something which is being learned as a concept or theory, but rather it is passed on by informed experience and practical demonstration. And indigenous knowledge is also stored in people's memories and activities, and is expressed in stories, songs, folklore, proverbs, dance, myths, cultural values, belief, rituals, community laws, local languages and taxonomy, agriculture practices, equipment, materials, plants, species and animal breeds. Now, it is not something which is being documented in sort of a classroom, or which is similar to the formal knowledge. Therefore, this IK is usually stored in memories and activities, and which is expressed in a multiple ways. So therefore, if we take the examples of let us say memory, now will it be feasible if a particular community is being displaced from a particular environment? Will they still be in possession of this knowledge? Because normally those are being stored in their memories, and also keeping aside the activities. Now, therefore, with their constant interactions with the environment and their surroundings, or maybe with the flora and fauna, and then so on and so forth, they have stored this knowledge through their memories and activities, and usually which are being learned through experience. It is also a practical common sense, which are based on good reasoning and logic built on experience. Now, therefore, one needs to understand the indigenous knowledge in that sense, how it is being expressed, how it is being stored, because normally the modern science is interested in mostly documenting their knowledge, because they feel that this knowledge which is orally handed down can in a way vanish after a point. So therefore, there's been the research which normally focuses on trying to document this indigenous knowledge, and I'm sure in the works of like the P.S. Ramakrishnan annotated ecologists have been extensively working in the northeast region in the past few decades, and also tries to document some of the shifting cultivators, their knowledge, experience, skills, so on and so forth. So therefore, this idea of indigenous knowledge systems are in a way which are cumulative and representing the generations of experiences, which are based on careful observations and also through the means of these trial and error experiments. Now, to put it in a very simple note, because the edible items like vegetables, fruits, so on and so forth, even animals for that matter. Now, not every vegetables is edible, or not every fruit is fit for human consumption, or maybe depending on the kind of taste. So this taste in a way is being developed over and over, different successive generations. But mind you, the manner in which these edible items were first discovered, or maybe let's say from the knowledge of the bricolage, it is being reused to solve their problems, which of course is already an available resources. Now, in that this idea of trial and error experiments were pretty much evident, and then which is pretty much seen in the context of this how these indigenous knowledge systems are being developed. Now, indigenous knowledge in a way is also based on the intimate knowledge of the land, water, snow and ice, weather and wildlife, and also the relationship between all aspects of the environment. Now, why is it that this knowledge has to be located in terms of the intimate knowledge of all this? Because it is not confined to only a specific object or perspective. It is a multidimensional understanding of intimate relationship with, and this is how the vastness or the indigenous knowledge is being formed. Now, for instance, if you look at the tribal communities, their own engagement and their understanding of landscape, their societies of the and then their stories of nature and their lived histories might in a way reveal that these forest communities history relationship with the landscape have developed into a more sophisticated knowledge of the jungle environment. Now, how? Because these are not something which are being learned overnight or maybe a few months time or a year, but it is a constant engagement and sort of based on the lived histories. So therefore, maybe their knowledge is pretty much extensive, and they are very much well versed with the environment which they are pretty much located. So that's how this knowledge is being formed and established. Now, it is not something that like the modern days of the urban affluent people, like going to the wild and then being there for a few days and enjoying the sort of environment or surroundings over there. So that sort of brief visit might not be adequate for someone to have this sort of form a sophisticated knowledge, because it requires an engagement and their understanding of the landscapes. So this would perhaps be possible only if somebody really makes sense of their natural resource, how they are being managed, and it's not just about simply managing, but it also becomes parts of their socio-cultural practices. So therefore, it has a multidimensional or in-depth meaning of how one tries to situate and understand. Now, let us try to look at the works of Tim Ingold, another ecological anthropologist, in his work called Dwelling Perspective. Now, what does Tim Ingold try to exposit in his works over here? Now, he argued what he calls as a dwelling perspective, that is a perspective that situates the human being in an active engagement with the constituents of his or her surroundings. That is, in a way, this active engagement is also a segment of that indigenous knowledge. So one needs to have this active engagement with the constituents of his or her surroundings. So that's perhaps the the foundation of how indigenous knowledge is being developed. Now, Ingold's works also concerns mainly the foraging community, that is the people who are engaged in hunting and gathering, and also the pastoral communities, people who are today often defined as indigenous people. And here he identifies a common relational understanding of them and their life world. Now, when we talk about understanding of them and their life world, we are also looking at how the way in which the so-called cosmology, or the manner in which social practices, economic, political, so on and so forth, everything is being embedded. So one needs to have a thorough understanding, or one needs to identify this common relational understanding of the indigenous people and their life world, how they functioned in making sense of not just their subsistence but also beyond. IK in a way is shared and communicated orally by specific examples and through culture. So it has to have that cultural connotations, and it needs to have that sort of in-depth meaning which is being attached within that situated within that cultural context. Now, indigenous forms of this communication and organizations are also vital to local level decision making processes and to the preservation, development and spread of indigenous knowledge. Now, as we also had already discussed that how IK is being stored in not just in people's memory also, but in activities. Now, IK is as discussed is transmitted by word of mouth, so it is vulnerable to rapid change, especially when people are being displaced. That is maybe through a process of development projects, or it can be anything, voluntary or involuntary, or when young people acquire values and lifestyles different from those of their ancestors. So normally as people becomes much more let's say educated or in a western line, they normally tends to move away from their early ways of life and as a result, there is a possibility of a rapid change in indigenous knowledge. Now, as I was talking, like we also should try to look at the differences between indigenous knowledge and scientific knowledge. Now, Agrawal in a way was the perhaps gives a very good differentiation between this IK and scientific knowledge. Now, what he contends is that the critical difference between this indigenous knowledge and scientific knowledge lies in their relationship to power, and that is not the holders of IK who exercise the power to marginalize. Now, that the holders of this IK who exercise the powers to marginalize, that is perhaps one of the critical difference. That is, indigenous people have demonstrated through their own use and application of IK and their own survival that their knowledge system are based on sound concepts. Therefore, there is now mounting scientific evidence that IK concepts are sound, and this concept should in a way be able to stand up to assessment and evaluation. Now, since the only differences between them is the in terms of their relationship to power, that is obviously the people who possess the scientific knowledge usually claims that they are at the upper hand, but now there's a an increasing a dramatic turn where the IK also have these concepts are considered to be adequate in terms of engaging in assessment and evaluations. Now, that is just a quick differences between the IK and scientific knowledge. Now, I would like to not really delve into the development process as such, but usually when we talk about the indigenous peoples in relationship to development, one thing we should remember is the idea of this life project. Then what is life project? Life projects are something which are pretty much important for the indigenous people, as because local histories are embedded, and they also encompass a visions of the world, that is the future, that are distinct from the embodied by projects promoted by state and markets. And also life projects in a way should diverge from development in their attention to the uniqueness of people's experience of place and self, and their rejections of visions that are claimed to be universal. Thus, these life projects are in a way premised in densely, uniquely woven threads of landscape memories, expectations, and desires. So, as we were talking about indigenous knowledge, how their knowledge are being stored in memories and activities. So, therefore, one needs to know the life projects of the indigenous people when somebody is trying to even talk or think about or initiate any kind of development. Why? Because they share a significant relationship with their environment or the land, because their histories are embodied in it, and also they have this landscape as not something which is from the utilitarian perspective, but they do have that threads of connection which ultimately becomes a cultural landscape, and the memories and expectations and desires. So, one of the some of the concerns which needs to be examined in connection to this counterpoint is the contrast between indigenous people's life projects as which is place-based perspective, and on the other hand, the universalist visions that justify and shape development projects. Now, this sort of counterpoints needs to be understood, because normally we always talk about any kind of development programs are seen to be affecting the indigenous people, and then their interests, livelihoods are being affected. But one needs to look at the kind of how these life projects of the indigenous peoples are into operating. Now, how indigenous people pursue their life projects, how these indigenous people pursue their life projects against those development projects being done at their expense in the context of these emerging structures of governance and subordinations. Now, over here we can see the idea of how the kind of development projects which are being initiated and backed by the state are being pursued against the interests of the indigenous people, that is, which is antithetical to their life projects. Now, therefore, these have crop up the idea of how this idea of governance and subordination is being meted out against the indigenous people. And then the question arises, why is their human rights or rights to access to those resources being affected by the state-led development projects? Now, how in spite of this, indigenous peoples, their willingness to share land and resources with other users, the question is not that they outrightly reject, or they don't cooperate, or they are not ready to even share their resources, but the question is, despite their willingness to share, the development projects are on the one hand not unwilling to recognize and seek to obscure coexistence. So, there is this denial of this coexistence, that is the feeling of this superiority, or if not, as if the development projects led by the states are doing something or acting against the interests of the indigenous people, because this whole idea of accommodations or bringing them in this project is something which is being missed. Now, therefore, despite their willingness, because many a times the policymakers and planners or development projects practitioners often blame the indigenous peoples for not cooperating, and then against this idea of development. So, therefore, one needs to look at how these life projects, or if not, what is the real interest of the the indigenous people. The emergence of this modernity, as Latour says, has been marked by a persistent blindness to connections and hybridity not only between nature and society, but also between the vertical and horizontal threads that make up place. So, this idea of how nature and society has to be looked at, or this the deep divide between this nature and society emerged as a result of this modernity. Now, therefore, there has been a constant persistent blindness to connections between the two. Perhaps this is because in the face of these relentless attacks through colonizations, the process of this assimilation, development, all put together aimed at suppressing the vertical threads, sapping their sense of place and identity. Life projects are in a way devoted in large part to permanently rebuilding and strengthening those vertical threads. Now, this idea of how nature and society in a way is being located, and all this process of this colonizations, assimilation and development all tries to aims at suppressing the vertical threads that shape their sense of place and identity. Now, in vertical threads, it has the indigenous people share some kind of an idea of how their connections with nature. Now, another ecologist, that is Deborah McGregor, point out that this traditional indigenous knowledge is critical to the indigenous people's identity making, and also it emerges not only from a history of engagement with the landscape, that is the vertical threads, but also from the struggle that indigenous people sustained with the newcomers, that is as a result of the process of colonization, assimilations, or maybe as a result of those development projects. Now, as Deborah had pointed out, that this traditional indigenous knowledge is critical to the identity making, because these people have a history of engagement with the landscape. So, when there's a forceful intrusion into the domain of the indigenous people, this history of engagement with landscape or the vertical threads which they share with the environment or nature in a way is being disturbed and affected. Now, she further argues that this framing the indigenous people and their knowledge within the dichotomous terms of modernity in a way amounts to losing the richness and complexity of their life projects, which also include the ingrained criticism of power asymmetries and the possibilities they can offer for their survival, for the survival of creation. What that is creation again? Creation is something how they sort of share a holistic a relationship with their natural surroundings. Now, why is it that there is a idea of this, the coexistence and politics of resilience from the indigenous people? Because these life projects are in a way pursued as an uphill task, where the dominant values of this development and evolutionary progress, which are pretty much being supported and then based on the the Western scientific knowledge, all this in a way not only block the indigenous people's way, but also continuously subordinate them. Now, because based on this evolutionary process, as we had discussed in the idea of this, the bricolage and the scientists, and how they are in a way being subordinated. But as Levi-Strauss has categorically pointed out, that it is only that the way in is they are in a way engaged in their own rightful thinking or in their own ways of thinking. So there's nothing called which of the two is much more progressed or maybe advanced, but rather it has it operationalized in a different setting. Now, these indigenous people struggle against development often involve a resistance. That is the idea of a politics of partners, its visions, that is political horizon, its prospects in the face of this development and globalization processes. Now, globally and then even in the Indian context for that matter, you have been familiar with the follow up the news when the decades of protests against the server dam, that is the Narmada Bachao Andolan, which is still very much part, and then the dam evictees, the Adivasis communities are not fully compensated. Their life projects are being affected, their life projects are being destroyed and hampered, but still despite so much of resistance, the government in a way, or the these dominant values of development which is led by the state are not able to accommodate the needs of those or the plights of those people. So, one needs to locate or situate this process of development not just as simply saying that the marginalized or the Adivasis have nothing better than to come up and then resist what is supposedly being understood or considered to be welfare for the state. So, the idea is as we were saying, the Adivasis are not against any kind of sort of development, for instance, but maybe their rightful in the domain of those resources are not being recognized. So, what they ask is to respect their rights on those resources, or maybe on the other hand, one has to do a judicious compensation, or maybe the so-called R&R policies, rehabilitation, resettlement policies, which are enshrined in the sort of constitutions, has to be followed and abide by. So, as Pramod Prajuli argues that peasants and indigenous people who depend on the maintenance and regenerations of these ecosystems for their livelihood constitute a barrier to the motion of a global capital. Now, therefore, they have so much connections, and there are so much dependence on the ecosystem that which in a way is seen to be a barrier to the motion of this global capital, which is being guided by accumulations or exploitations of the resource to meet the present requirements, and it does not have any future scope of the idea of regenerations of ecosystem. It is important for the indigenous people because since they live and rely on it, they believe in reproducing it and then regenerating it. Having to ensure these the symbiotic connections between the human collectivities and the non-human collectivities, they stand in the way of development. Now, the local knowledge in this environmental development discourse also needs to be discussed over here, because this local knowledge system have been this subject of an increasing attention, not just confined to the anthropologists and environmental researchers and development experts, because local knowledge have been usually portrayed as a part of a romantic past, as the major obstacle to development, because it's not just the life projects, or rather the idea of this close connection to ecosystems oftentimes become as a barrier to the development projects. So, therefore, this local knowledge which have been misrepresented as the romantic past has always been portrayed as a major obstacle to development, which in a way is a panacea for dealing with not the most environmental problems. That is, according to Posey, this local knowledge has been viewed as practical, collective, and strongly rooted in place. So, these are partly something which we have already discussed, but as Posey and this Warren has tried to relocate what local knowledge is in the context of the indigenous peoples and environment development discourse. Now, the question is why sudden interest in indigenous knowledge. Why? Because the interest of these outsiders, that is the professionals, that is managers, planners, scientists, policy makers, even the decision makers, in this so-called old traditional knowledge is recent and emerged in tandem with the politicization of indigenous groups and the indigenous rights movement. Now, similarly, therefore, there is this idea of how knowledge is recent and emerged in tandem with the politicization of in the recent decades. Many indigenous peoples are today demanding their right to be heard in the development decisions, and this often includes demanding their rights to land and resources be recognized and officially acknowledged. And of late, indigenous knowledge has been lauded as an alternative collective wisdom relevant to a variety of matters at a time when the existing norms, values, and laws are increasingly called into question. Now, therefore, there is an increasing realization that IK, which in a way is perhaps seen to be an alternative as a result of the kind of problems which we are encountering, that is the environmental ecological crisis which we are facing now. Now, as we had also discussed partly how indigenous knowledge is embedded, or the life project which are pretty much embedded in land and identity. Now, how then is this indigenous people pretty much the knowledge being closely related with the land and identity, because indigenous knowledge comprises the skills and acquire intelligence which is responding to the constantly changing social and natural environments. Now, the skills and intelligence in a way also has evolved as a result of the natural environments. So, the kind of this adaptable mechanism is also something which is to be seen in the context of the indigenous technology, because perhaps they are the ones who are facing the brunt of this climate change the most, and they have been like evolving themselves and trying to adapt with the kind of this changing natural environment. So, they in the process they tend to develop certain skills and intelligence as a result of these changes. Now, this beyond pure knowledge, it also stretches people's ways of knowing and their experiences, sentiments, and loyalties of belonging, that is their relationship with land. So, oftentimes the kind of relationship which they share with land is seen from the perspective of sustenance, or livelihood. Rather, it goes beyond that, and their connections with the land is something which is to be seen in terms of their cultural identity and their loyalties of not just defending, but regenerations of the ecosystem, as we are talking about. Now, for the indigenous peoples, the territories, resources, and the environment are inextricably linked both spiritually and culturally. This inextricable relationship in terms of the spiritual and culturally, in short, the environment is an essential part of their culture and spirituality. Now, if the question is if the environment happens to also represent these interlinkages of the spiritual and the cultural aspect, then the environment becomes sort of a sacred and then something which is seen as not from the perspective of exploitation, but rather from the ideas of protection. Right? Now, the biodiversity is more seen from the angle of this spiritual and the cultural thing. So, therefore, that notion of sense of stewardship or being a custodian emerges. Now, how do we understand this indigenous knowledge in a local context? This context is constituted out of these physical facts, that is, Ness in a way talks about the social interactions among people in the surroundings they perceive as their world and spiritual belief. And in other words, indigenous knowledge is a human life experience in a particular socio-cultural setting of the survival of a community. For example, indigenous people have for centuries maintained a very unique relationship with their environment, that is in terms of protection of the environment essential for their food sovereignty and food security. Now, therefore, from the Western modernist perspective, many of these indigenous peoples are seen to be, living below poverty, or maybe, they are leading that sort of not sufficient enough to have their edible, if not from the accumulation of wealth, so and so forth. But if you look or observe closely, since the indigenous people's economics is mostly guided by subsistence, they don't have the urge to accumulate, if not engage in storing or engage in cropping system where you have surplus or abundance. They produce things which are adequate for their family, and they are being in a way guided by this idea of egalitarianism. So, therefore, this idea of accumulation of wealth, so and so forth, is rather something which is not part and parcel of their economic knowledge. So, therefore, as long as they protect the environment, the sovereignty of the food is pretty much being secure, and they need not worry about other things. So, therefore, the Western notions of knowledge or economics is something which is different in the context of the indigenous people. Now, what are the kind of relationship between this knowledge and land? As we said, knowledge is inseparable from the land. According to the study of Regorodetsky, the term land is not restricted to the physical environment only. It has a much more broader meaning, used by the indigenous people to refer to the physical, biological and spiritual environment which is fused together, and the closest scientific equivalent of the land taken without its spiritual component is the ecosystem. Now, therefore, one can look at or locate the kind of relationship which the indigenous people share, the relationship with the land, and then how this knowledge is being premised in that particular environment. Now, Alfred also states that the indigenous belief usually which is reflecting a spiritual connection with the land established by the Creator gives human beings special responsibilities within the area they occupy as indigenous peoples, linking them in a natural way to their territories. So, therefore, this sort of spiritual connection is being seen even in the works of Alfred, wherein how these beliefs are being reflected in terms of their spiritual connections between the two. Now, traditional knowledge again is more or less based on the practical common sense, good reasoning and logic, which are built on experience, and which we have already seen in the brief explanation given by Levi-Strauss' works on the bricolage on the scientist. The wisdom usually comes in using knowledge and ensuring that it is used in a good way. So, knowledge or wisdom is something not used to harm the other beings. So, rather it has to be used in a good way, that is for the prosperity, or if not the maintaining some certain kind of a balance. So, it involves using the head and the heart together. So, most often time the idea of using arms is to cause a violence rather than being used as a defense. So, humans have the tendency of using arms in a more offensive way rather than in a more defensive way. So, therefore, we are oftentimes being guided by the head, that is the psyche of dominations, if not harming others, and not by using both the head and the heart. The heart in a way is pretty much related with the deep connections which shares between, not just between human and humans, but also the humans and non-humans, of being caring, nurturing, being emotional. That sort of bonding in a way is being created. So, therefore, traditional knowledge is not simply a common sense based on good reasoning and logic built on experience, but it also strongly talks about the idea of using the head and the heart together. Now, therefore, this traditional knowledge is dynamic yet stable and is usually shared in stories, songs, dance and myths. So, this is what Roberts has in a way tries to talk about in the traditional ecological knowledge. Now, why is this coexistence again important? As we were talking about the differences between the TEK and Western science, from a Western science perspective, this traditional ecological knowledge and sustainable development or sustainability are discrete concepts, whereas from an Aboriginal or the indigenous people's perspective, they are intimately related and are in fact part of the same continuum or circle. So, in a way it is not something which is seen as a linear concept, but those are seen to be circle and then which is cyclical. So, there is a chain of connections which exists between them. Now, coexistence in a way may serve potentially promising bridge between the two worldviews. That is, the coexistence approach does not devalue Western or indigenous resource management practices and the knowledge that informs them. Rather, this coexistence between indigenous knowledge and Western science are to be bring in together. That is, it can have this idea or this coexistence, because coexistence does not allow for the domination of one over the other. So, therefore, will there be a possibility of a coexistence between the Western science or the indigenous knowledge, because both systems are valued, and most importantly for Aboriginal people, their cultural survival is assured. Now, I have been trying to inject few different themes by trying to club together within the indigenous knowledge and traditional ecological knowledge. What we should understand is how this knowledge system is perceived or to be located in the so-called development discourse, and how the indigenous people life projects is differently to be seen, and is there any possibility of a coexistence between the two, because coexistence normally talks about there's no binary, and then there's no idea of dominance of one over the other. So, there has to be sort of an equal share in terms of this idea of understanding the resources. And I am sure we have also tries to make sense of what indigenous knowledge and traditional ecological knowledge by the work of mainly Levi-Strauss and also others like Deborah McGregor and then Sealands, Mithusens and others. So, you can have a much more wide understanding by looking at the by going through these readings, and partly we have discusses the relationship between indigenous knowledge and natural resource management.